The Forgotten Tunnel. Jack and Tom had always been the adventurous type. Growing up in the small, quiet town of Ravensbrook left little room for excitement, so they often sought it out wherever they could. Old ruins, abandoned buildings, and deep forests had become their playgrounds. But there was one place they had always avoided. The Forgotten Tunnel. The tunnel was hidden deep in the woods, half collapsed and covered in creeping vines. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted. No one had dared to explore it in decades. Stories of strange sounds, missing pets, and eerie symbols etched into the walls surrounded its legend. But Jack and Tom, now in their early 20s, were skeptical of ghost stories. One late autumn afternoon, fueled by boredom and a desire for something thrilling, they decided to visit the tunnel and finally settle the mystery once and for all. "We'll go in, take some photos, maybe find some old graffiti, and be back out before it gets dark," Jack said confidently, as they packed a flashlight, a few bottles of water, and their phones. Tom wasn't as enthusiastic, but didn't want to seem cowardly. "Sure, why not?" he said with a shrug. "It's just a tunnel." The walk through the forest was peaceful at first, the golden orange leaves crunching under their boots as they made their way toward the tunnel. The air was crisp, and the fading light of the evening sun cast long shadows through the trees. But as they neared the tunnel's entrance, an oppressive quiet fell over the woods. The birds had stopped singing, and the winds seemed to die in the trees. The entrance loomed before them, wide and gaping, like the mouth of some forgotten beast. The stone archway was cracked, moss clinging to its surface, and the once faded warning sign had long since been swallowed by the forest. "Here we go," Jack said, flicking on his flashlight as they stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the cool air of the tunnel brushing against their skin like icy fingers. Their footsteps echoed in the damp, dark passage, and the beam of Jack's flashlight barely pierced the heavy darkness. The walls were lined with strange, cryptic symbols, circles, triangles, and jagged shapes that neither of them recognized. "Looks like someone's been down here before." Tom muttered, running his hand along the stone. His fingers came away cold and slick with moisture. "Yeah, but these don't look like any graffiti I've ever seen," Jack said, his voice lower now, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something. "They look older." As they ventured deeper, the air seemed to grow thicker, almost suffocating. The dampness clung to their clothes, and the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. Jack stopped suddenly, raising his hand to signal for silence. "Do you hear that?" Tom listened, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, there was nothing but the faint drip of water from the ceiling. But then, there it was. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing from somewhere behind them. They spun around, flashing their lights down the tunnel. It was empty. The darkness seemed to swallow their beams of light whole. "Probably just an echo," Tom said, though his voice trembled slightly. "Let's keep going. We'll find the end soon." But the further they walked, the louder the footsteps became, always behind them, never beside or in front, just out of sight. Jack and Tom exchanged uneasy glances, but neither wanted to be the one to suggest turning back. The symbols on the walls grew stranger, more erratic, and they began to notice other remnants, small piles of bones, animals hopefully, arranged in unsettling patterns, melted candles stuck to the ground in puddles of wax, feathers, beads, and what looked like pieces of old clothing hung from the ceiling by thin, rotting strings. "This isn't right," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "We should have found the end by now." Jack checked his phone for the time. "It's been over an hour. This tunnel can't be this long. It didn't look like it from the outside." They turned back the way they came, their footsteps still following, now accompanied by soft whispers, words they couldn't understand, carried on a wind that didn't belong in the tunnel. They quickened their pace, the tunnel seeming to close in around them. The air was so thick now, it felt like they were breathing through a wet cloth. Their flashlight beams flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then, just ahead, they saw it, the entrance. "Thank God," Tom breathed. He broke into a jog, his heart pounding with relief. But as they neared the light, the entrance seemed to blur. It shifted, growing smaller, more distant, until it vanished completely. They stopped dead in their tracks. The tunnel was endless. "That doesn't make any sense," Jack stammered, his voice shaking. "We were almost out." Tom backed up, his eyes wide with panic. "We should have never come here. We need to get out." They turned back again, running now, the footsteps behind them quickening to match their pace. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were being called deeper into the tunnel. And then the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing with a sickly green light. The oven on the stove was flicking around, and as they ran, the tunnel itself seemed to shift and warp. The ground beneath them sloped, the walls twisting, like they were alive. And Jack, tripped. And there's this flashlight clattering to the ground and flickering out. "Jack!" Tom shouted, turning back to help him up. But when Jack looked up, Tom was gone. The tunnel stretched on endlessly in both directions, and the footsteps had stopped. He was alone. "Tom?" Jack's voice echoed back to him, the silence that followed more terrifying than any sound. "Ah." He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight flickering back to life, just long enough to illuminate the figure standing a few feet away from him. It was Tom, or at least it looked like him. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and empty, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. "Tom?" Jack whispered, taking a step back. But the fair tower didn't move. And then, slowly, it began to fade, dissolving into the darkness. Jack ran. He didn't know which way he was going anymore, but he had to move. The tunnel seemed to close in on him, the walls shifting, the whispers now coming from inside his own head. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and Jack tumbled into a deep, black pit. The last thing he heard, before the darkness swallowed him whole, was the sound of footsteps and the whispers calling his name.